Can you go touring on a sporty retro bike like the Triumph Speed Twin? And is it worthwhile doing if you only have a weekend free? Well, in this video we're going to find out as I ride across France into the Ardennes forest in Belgium in search of twisty roads and pretty scenery, all in 48 hours and all on what is by all means a fairly uncomfortable bike. Now, my journey started with a 2-hour hop down to the Le Shuttle terminal in Folkestone in the southeast corner of England. The roads were pretty boring, so instead of showing you that, I'll tell you a bit about the crossing. For those of you who don't know, Le Shuttle is the train that runs between England and France in a tunnel under the English Channel. This was my first time on the Channel Tunnel, so I didn't know what to expect, but it was really easy and pretty much zero fuss. I turned up 45 minutes early and just followed my nose. You check in with the QR code on your confirmation email and you can't really go wrong from there. It's just all one way, all the way to the train. I should say though that there's no petrol station at the UK terminal to France, and I'd recommend you fill up before you get to France, as I got absolutely rogered filling up in Calais, more on which later. The train ticket is dirt cheap and cost me just £67 return, and the crossing time is 30 minutes, so you're on the continent before you know it. France is of course an hour ahead though, so it is worth getting there as soon as possible so you don't lose any daytime riding on the other side. And if I was to do this again, I would have left a bit earlier, and despite leaving my house in Woking before 8 AM, it was almost midday in France time by the time I set foot in Calais. Now, I chose the cheapest ticket, which means you have a fixed arrival and departure time, but there are slightly more expensive options if you want to be able to arrive plus or minus 4 hours after your scheduled journey time, or for a few extra quid you can turn up whenever you want like an absolute gangster. Getting the bike on the train is really easy. You just follow everyone else and then they guide you into your parking spot. You don't need to strap the bike down, you just leave it in gear, and while the journey is a tiny little bit wobbly, the bike didn't ever feel unstable, and of course, unlike a ferry crossing, you won't be affected by rough seas and uncontrollable vomiting. Now, there's no seating area, so you just lean on the train wall next to your bike and wait for the journey to finish. There's really not much else to say about the crossing. It was pretty uneventful and was just like any other train journey, except that you get to look at your bike while you wait. At the end of the journey, all of the internal carriage doors open to make one big runway, and it was surprising just how far you have to travel inside the train itself before you get to freedom. When I got to Calais then, I filled up at the petrol station at the terminal exit, which is where the aforementioned rogering took place. I put in €30 of fuel, but the self-service machine took €200 off me. Now, it did refund the difference several days later, and I think that actually only happens if you use a debit card, not a credit card, but I forgot to change the petrol pump screen to English, and because I only speak franglais, I just mashed at various buttons until it gave me petrol. So let me know in the comment section below if you know how to avoid the €200 shafting. Now, this video is effectively part 2 of 2, as I made a separate video showing the trip to Belgium. The purpose of that leg was to see how many miles I could get if I completely drained the tank to zero, and I'll link that video at the end if you want to see how I got on. I won't spoil it for those of you who haven't seen it, but I think you'll be quite surprised at just how far this bike can go on a single tank of fuel. In short though, I found myself stopping every couple of hours and taking relatively long breaks. It was 31 degrees C on the day in question, which is 88 Fahrenheit, and that made me feel quite tired at times, so I needed regular stops to keep me fresh and boost my concentration levels. I had also chosen to take my luggage in a backpack, which was an absolutely bloody terrible idea. It was really heavy at about 9 kilos or 20 pounds, which didn't help with the tiredness, and because it was completely stuffed full, I had no spare space at all, so I couldn't even take a bottle of water with me from one of my stops. And in fact, as soon as I got home, I ponied up the 360 quid for a set of SW Motec Blaze panniers for my next trip. In terms of comfort on day one on the bike itself, it actually wasn't too bad. The complete lack of wind protection meant that I didn't want to do much more than 70 miles an hour for any length of time, not necessarily because of the wind blast, but because of just how noisy it got in my helmet, even with earplugs in. And being restricted to 70 or less is not ideal when you have 250 miles to cover and when you keep making several stops. My knees also felt a little bit locked in because of the tilted forward seating position, and the Speedy isn't a bike you can really stretch out on, so you can't really take your weight off your knees. And my 43-year-old shoulders were pretty stiff throughout the journey, mainly because of the backpack, but also partly because of the bike's ergos. However, on a cooler day and without a stupid heavy backpack, it would have been absolutely fine. Don't get me wrong, I would rather have been on an adventure bike for the long and boring bits, but in the past I've been reluctant to tour on sporty naked bikes that aren't necessarily built for comfort, whereas now I wouldn't hesitate to do it again, and as with many things in life, it's not as bad as you think it'll be. Now, I'd chosen a city in Belgium called Liège as my stopping point at the end of day one, for no better reason than it was a convenient location and it was a city that I'd heard of. The road into Liège along the river was quite pretty, and it helped that I was arriving in the golden hour, but all of the stopping throughout my journey meant that I didn't get to my overnight stop in Liège until 9 PM, at which point I was absolutely bloody knackered. As it turns out, it was my mobile phone. I had my phone plugged into the bike's USB cable, but the battery was almost dead by the time I got to Liège, despite me having charged the phone at the various stopping points along the way. And the USB cable on the bike only trickle charges the phone, which means the battery doesn't charge properly and rather just discharges more slowly. Now, this was my Airbnb in Liège for the night. It was 120 quid for an entire apartment, which is pretty good value given how nice the flat was, but this was really just somewhere to rest my head, and the actual reason I chose it was because it came with secure parking for my bike. However, when I got to the car park, the automatic gate was locked and my pass to get in wasn't working, so I ended up leaving the bike in a random multi-storey car park instead, which meant I spent the night convinced that it was going to get stolen. So to be honest with you, it was a bit of a relief to find it where I left it the next day. And while Liège is a perfectly nice city, if I did this trip again, I'd stay in a town or village rather than a city, firstly to save a bit of cash, but also so I didn't have to worry about theft, and I'll show you a much better option of where I would recommend in a minute. With my day of travel behind me then, it was on to day 2 and the fun stuff. Because this was just a 48-hour road trip, I couldn't do as much exploring as I would have liked to do, so I set the sat-nav to take me to a town called La Roche-en-Ardennes, right in the heart of the Ardennes forest. The roads at the start of the journey on the way weren't particularly exciting, but I love green trees and blue skies, so even this stint was really enjoyable and relaxing for me, and I just felt completely chilled and switched off from the usual stresses of life. However, the roads did get better, and the best road I'd seen yet was the Route de Bastogne, aka the N888. The scenery was a mix of undulating hills, open grassland and dense forest, and the road was a fast single track with enough bends to keep you interested, while also having some nice straights for you to twist the throttle. The road surface wasn't fantastic quality, but the traffic was pretty clear and there were plenty of overtaking opportunities when I did get held up. Although frustratingly, I got stuck behind a car on the best part of the road, and because I was on a tight schedule, I didn't have time to turn around and do it again, which I would have done if I had more time. But to be honest, I wasn't here to set lap records, and even with fairly gentle fun riding, I had an absolute blast. Now, because I have an MT10, the Speed Twin doesn't feel massively fast to me at 96 horsepower, but it's got good torque and it's definitely sporty enough to make the best of these kind of roads, and it was a lot more fun than my V-Strom would have been, so I was happy. The town of La Roche-en-Ardennes was very pretty indeed, and given it's only an hour past Liège, I was regretting my decision to stop at Liège for the night. Now, I would have had to take fewer breaks on day 1 to make it this far, but that absolutely would have been worth it. Now, doing a 48-hour road trip like this is 1,000 times better than not doing a road trip at all, but it does mean you feel a bit rushed, and even just having one extra day would have meant that I could have explored La Roche and various other similar towns around the area a little bit more, as well of course as the surrounding roads around them. And because I had an underwater train to catch, I couldn't stay here for long, so I grabbed a bite to eat, then headed off. Now, the road I wanted to do next was the N89 to Sam-Château, which is this little bit of Belgian spaghetti, but that would take me further away from home, and the lack of time meant that I had to point my bike in the direction of home instead. That wasn't exactly a hardship though, and the Ardennes forest is just very pretty wherever you go, so I didn't mind being sent off my ideal course. And before I did set off, I checked the weather forecast to make sure I'd avoid any showers. I had nothing but sunshine for the first 36 hours, and the BBC weather app said it would be dry if I headed northwest to a place called Libin on the N40, which I also decided looked like a pretty decent road, so off I went, safe in the knowledge that nothing but sunshine lay ahead. Oh dear, well, it turns out the weather forecast was wrong. Who'd have thought, eh? The N40 was indeed a really nice riding road, but I am no Valentino Rossi, and so I just took it really steady and hoped the rain would pass, which of course it didn't. Fortunately, in anticipation of the precipitation, I had at least stopped to put my waterproof overjacket and trousers on, but the rain was going nowhere, so I stopped at the first restaurant I could find to grab a bite to eat and wait for the dry stuff to come back. Now, in the time it took me to have lunch, the rain did eventually pass, but the roads were still pretty wet, so there would be no more twisties for me on this trip. To make up for that though, I set the route back home to Calais to avoid motorways, so at least I would avoid the soul-destroying dullness. And because of that, I actually really enjoyed the journey back. Avoiding motorways meant the journey would take 7 hours instead of 5, but for me that was a small price to pay, and both myself and the bike were much happy bimbling through pretty villages than we were sitting on the motorway. All in all then, I covered a total of 771 miles on this trip in just 2 days. Before I set off, I wasn't really sure what to expect of the bike in terms of comfort, and I was a little concerned that it might just be an unmitigated disaster. Now don't get me wrong, that was a lot of miles to cover on a bike like this, and a lot more saddle time than I would like in a single weekend, and to be honest with you, by the time I got home it was gone 10 PM and I was absolutely exhausted and passed out as soon as my head hit the pillow. But that's not exactly surprising after back-to-back days of riding for 12 hours per day, and apart from that, the bike was actually fine. My knees and shoulders were a bit achy, and the backpack of course was a terrible idea, but ultimately this trip gave me the confidence to take any bike I have on tour. And while I wouldn't recommend buying a Speed Twin to go on tour, I would recommend going on tour if you've bought a Speed Twin. And the last thing I will say is that there are a lot of insects in the Ardennes forest, most of which I brought back with me, so I gave the old girl a good old soaping the next day. Now, I have more Speed Twin videos in the pipeline, as well as a few on my V-Strom 800 and my MT10 SP, and I also have a full video coming soon on my motorbike garage build. So make sure you like and subscribe for all of that, and until next time, ride safe.